Go. So it is now recording. Perfect. All righty. And that looks like Meg. So perfect timing. So we'll get Meg on board. All right. So, welcome everyone. I'm Quinn Walcott. I'm with the Summit Historical Society, and I'm so proud to present Strong Sisters, Elected Women in Colorado with Laura Hopner. And Meg is here as well. So we are a member organization, and I thank you all so much for joining us today for this wonderful, wonderful presentation that we have for you. And I will now turn it over to Laura and Meg.
Well, thank you, Quinn. My name is Laura Hepner, and Meg, are you here? Hello? Well, maybe she's not able to be with us fully. So Meg Froelich and I created Strong Sisters in 2016. It was released in 2016. It's a documentary film, 70 minutes long. And since it was released in 2016, it was in the Breckenridge Film Festival on Colorado Public Television, Channel 12. We've presented to lots of different organizations since then. And since 2016, my co-producer in this effort, Meg Froelich, became a state legislator. And so that's part of the struggle today is she is on a committee that meets on Wednesday afternoons. We would have thought they would be done by now, but apparently there's some voting going on or something. And so she will probably be popping in and out, hopefully soon, and help with the presentation and take any questions. She definitely has a new perspective as a state legislator on the history of elected women in Colorado. Before we get started, I don't know if folks have the capability of raising their hand or saying something in the chat box, but I'm curious how many people may or may not have seen Strong Sisters, if you've had the chance to see the film before, just so I have a sense of how much detail to go into. And Quinn, is there a way for us to see if anybody's responding to that? I think you have to unmute.
Unmuted. Yes. So there should be. We can put it in the chat. We have a few people coming through saying that they have and haven't. We have 2 haves and 1 have not.
Okay, great. All right. Well, if you haven't had a chance to see Strong Sisters, you can now see it for free on YouTube. You just search for Strong Sisters, Elected Women in Colorado. You can find the link to all of this through our strongsisters.org website. But we also have some DVDs available. I had some samples to hold up. Oh, there it is. We have a bunch of DVDs. We used to mostly sell the DVDs. Now people have moved to digital platforms online. But if you'd like a DVD, if that's an easier way to see the film or share it with someone, for those of you who registered for today's presentation, you can stop by the schoolhouse here, and Quinn has copies of these. You can have a copy, you can borrow a copy, whatever works for you. And we also have, before we made the film, Strong Sisters, I was doing a lot of research on the history of elected women in Colorado as the staff for, I was the staff for the Colorado Legislative Women's Caucus. And during that time, I wrote up a lot of little biographies about women who had served in the state legislature in the past. And that resulted in this little book that we put together. So you could pick up a copy of these as well here. We have a bunch of extras of those. So happy to share that information. And a lot of that information is also available at our website. So anyhow, just wanted to take care of that and not save all of that to the end so that you would know how to be able to see the film and share it with your friends and such. In any case, so Meg and I created this film, released it in 2016. We felt like it was really important to share Colorado's extraordinary history of elected women in Colorado. And in order to give you a little taste of that history, we'd like to show a clip of the film. And this will just be about a 5-minute clip. And Quinn, do you have that first clip available for us?
I do. Let me get that up for you.
Women in Colorado had been attempting to win the right to vote ever since before statehood.
At the state constitutional convention, giving women the right to vote was the most contentious issue.
A perfect storm really led to I believe, the successful passage of the women's suffrage referendum in 1893.
It was definitely a successful result of women joining together.
The success in getting women's suffrage in Colorado was not just a great sweeping glacier of a trend. It was far from that. It was people making choices and taking actions and working with each other and thinking all the time and then acting on those thoughts.
The wives of political leaders, bank owners, and mine owners, their wives got together and formed the first Colorado Equal Suffrage Association.
Whether they were women's clubs, whether or not they were women that were involved in the WCTU, faith-based organizations that organized with the Equal Suffrage Association, and they took every opportunity to kind of buttonhole that man in the street and say, this is why women need the right to vote.
Colorado was voting for the Populist Party at the time. I think that's a really big part of it.
Without that movement that was taking on the corporations, taking on the railroads, taking on the banks, taking on the Eastern establishment, and also endorsing women's suffrage, without the populist movement, I don't believe that their 1893 referendum would have been a success in Colorado.
And then in 1893, we had the worst depression that we've ever had in Colorado.
Congress demonetized the silver, and it really threw Colorado's economy down the toilet, or I guess the outhouse.
Talk about economic collapse. Unemployment, banks absolutely closed.
The dominoes started falling and the mines closed. Horace Tabor's famous silver mines in Leadville closed down. All over the state, we had these huge silver mines. And of course, those were filled with miners who were all of a sudden unemployed.
It was just incredible devastation.
The women, they looked around and saw all these unemployed people and said, wait, we can't do this suffrage campaign with all this poverty around us.
And oftentimes we argue it's not a good time for women to have the right to vote or for minorities to do this or that. But women were able to turn that around in 1893 and say, we can help. And I think the Panic of 1893 actually did have a positive effect, if you can say that, on women's right to vote.
With one hand, these women would be handing out a cup of soup, and with the other, a flyer. A propaganda flyer saying, if women can vote, we will clean up politics, we'll make things better for everyone. So it was a great strategy.
That economic calamity, in with the other factors, really spelled victory.
Let's now show people that we want that vote, we're going to use that vote, and we're going to elect what ended up to be the first 3 women in our House of Representatives.
So right away the next year, there were 3 women elected from Colorado to the state legislature. They were the first women elected in any state or territory. Clara Cressingham, Frances Klock, and Carrie Hawley. They were all Republican women, 2 from Denver and 1 from Pueblo. And we also can say with pretty great certainty that they were the first women elected to a legislature
Get an update on
in the world.
what's happening?
That's almost 27 years before women were given the vote throughout the United States.
Molly Brown, the unsinkable Molly Brown, ran for the state house in the 1910s. All kinds of women thought they could run, and many of them won.
Oh, here we go. All right. So did the video play for everyone?
No?
Oh,
Oh,
that's not good. Well, then maybe we just review the history piece of this while Quinn tries to figure out how we're going to be able to show some of the video clips. Sorry about that, folks. So Meg, do you want to talk a little bit about the history, starting with suffrage in 1893? Or
No, you want to just go through the slides and
sure, we can make our way through the slides.
oh, how did
There we go.
other people see the video and we didn't?
I'm not sure.
Oh.
I know that I'm not able to see it, but everybody else should be able to see and hear it.
Maybe it was a screen sharing thing or,
Yeah.
okay.
Let me see. The video clip worked fine, Susan says, so that's good. So let's just go on with some of the history stuff. So as we were saying, as the film shows, Colorado has this extraordinary history. Women in Colorado were given the right to vote through popular vote by the men, because they were the ones who could vote, in 1893. And shortly after that, women were elected to the state legislature. In 1894, 3 women ran for the state legislature. They were all 3 Republicans, and they were all 3, 2 of them were from Arapahoe County, which was Denver at the time, and 1 was from Pueblo. And they were the first women to serve in a legislative body in the US and in the world, as far as we can tell. The only other places where women could vote were like Wyoming and New Zealand, and they didn't have any women elected to their legislative bodies for a long time. So our 3 women in Colorado were the first ones in the world to be elected to a legislative body. And you might ask why? Why was Colorado the first place where women were elected to a legislature, where women got the vote so much earlier than women in the rest of the country, except for Wyoming? What we learned in our research is that women got the right to vote mostly because we're more of an industrial state. We were not an agricultural state. We were a state where people were in industrial mining towns, and women were creating civil society in those towns, and men recognized that. But then it also had a lot to do with the silver crisis and the rise of populism in Colorado. With the silver crisis of 1892, women at the same time in Denver were trying to get suffrage passed. They knew that it was going to be on the ballot, and they were trying to get suffrage passed. And they at first thought maybe they shouldn't be doing this while the silver crisis was going on, and so many people were falling into poverty and leaving the mining towns. But they very quickly realized that they could use this opportunity to make their case to men, to give them the right to vote. And what we saw in a lot of our research and our interviews with people is that women, that at times of crisis, our society is more willing to to make big changes. And so whether you're looking at the silver crisis or the Watergate scandals, Watergate issues, people are looking for change. They're looking for big change. And so the men in 1893 were willing to give women the right to vote. They at least figured that that women couldn't screw things up more than men already had. And so they gave women the right to vote. And let's see. So another example of how a crisis can create an opportunity for women, sorry, I'm juggling the screen here, is right here in Summit County. In Summit County in Frisco in 1913, so not that long after women were given the right to vote in the whole state, the people of Frisco found that the city council was not doing its job. The town of Frisco was running into fiscal crisis. There was a lot of financial irresponsibility, and the women kind of had it. So they decided to run for office, which was a radical and absurd idea at the time. And in 1913, the people of Frisco elected a woman mayor, Florence Hutter, I'm not exactly sure how to pronounce her name, and 6 women on the city council. There was a man as the town clerk, but for the most part, the leadership was women. And those women were not paid anything to be council members, and yet they brought financial responsibility back to the town. What this also led to was an acceptance of women in these kind of leadership positions. And so in 1917, another woman became mayor of Frisco. And what this illustrates for us is something that we'll see in our next clip, which is that women, and once you have women in office, you're likely to end up with more women in office. And that's part of the reason that what we see in Colorado is not just that we were the first, but that we continue to have a higher percentage of women in our state legislature than other states did over the course of the 20th century. And so part of the foundational building blocks is to have women elected early, like we had here in Colorado, and you didn't really see in very many other parts of the country. And that carries over into the future. And so Quinn, can we go ahead and show the next clip? I guess it's working for other folks.
Of course.
And
Let's
we'll show
get
the
that
next
up.
clip to kind of talk about why Colorado has been such a leader.
So in Colorado, women made up 31% of the legislature in 1991, 30 out of 100, and the number has remained at or above that level ever since. As a comparison, today in 2015, there are only 11 states where women are 30% or higher of the legislature. We look at these numbers and we wonder, what is it about Colorado? Why is it so different?
So I think it has to do with the way the state was formed, the fact that so many people came here on the way to someplace else.
And obviously there are a lot of individuals who were born and raised here, but we also attract a lot of people from other areas of the country.
I moved here and didn't know anyone. Almost everyone I've ever worked with came from some other place. And I think it's a state that really values merit.
I'm startled by the newness of Colorado. I think we're willing to try things because of the early settlers here came from the East where they were dissatisfied there.
I've heard from friends who have moved to New England states that if you don't have the right family and if you didn't go to the right school, it takes an entire lifetime to be accepted.
You know, here nobody cares.
I think that some of that culture doesn't exist here, which is good for women, good for breakthrough candidates.
You know, you want to go do something, you go recruit all your friends, you say, I'm going to do it, and I think people say, good for her.
I loved it. It was sort of a chance to reinvent yourself and grow.
And women, as newcomers, historically, I think had a better chance in the West.
This is the land of opportunity.
People come out here, feel undaunted, feel they can create the world they want, and that includes women.
Women have been encouraged a lot in Colorado, especially the last 10 years.
There has been an organized effort to try and recruit more women to run in office and be successful once they're there.
I think because it actually doesn't pay very well. In the states, I've talked to women who were legislative leaders who said when you talk to legislatures in other states that are very highly paid and highly staffed, those are very prestigious positions. It's very hard for women to get in.
Women in Colorado really make a strong effort to recruit other women to come behind them to fill those seats. since it's a state with term limits, everybody knows their end point, so to speak, and so can start planning for that really early on.
It seems whoever preceded you wants to reach back and help you come along with them and learn what they learned, and knowing that it's such a short time frame, trying to get you to learn as much as you possibly can as fast as you can.
One of the things that's been different about Colorado is because under our campaign finance laws we have limits. And say take a $400 limit. That is much, much lower than most other states. So it forces you to know more people and have a broader base of support. And you don't necessarily have to know someone who can write you a $10,000 check, because it doesn't do you any good under our campaign finance limits. You don't need to know millionaires. You don't need to know people who can write $1,000 checks, because they can't write $1,000 checks.
42 out of 100 legislators are women, so that's 42%. Colorado has led the nation in the percentage of women in the legislature since 2010 and has been among the top 10 states, so the 10 states with the highest percentage of women since at least 1975.
All right, well, thanks, Quinn, for showing that clip. Meg, do you want to talk a little bit about why Colorado, building on our history and the values?
Sure. So we have a couple things going on, as Laura mentioned. We have the fact that Denver was actually the largest city west of the Mississippi, and that urban landscape is a lot of times a way for women to break out of traditional roles. We have that we're in the West, and so we're breaking free from Eastern establishment, as mentioned in that clip, where you aren't judged by necessarily by your last name. There's a concept of the West being more of a meritocracy, which is on our slide as Western culture. There's the idea of the cowgirl, who is by her very nature breaking free of traditional roles. And there's portions of the movie where we discuss how ranch life doesn't lend itself to traditional gender roles. So there's a feeling that that plays a part. And then the silver crisis, which created an opportunity where women made the case that they were not only more trustworthy, on which they're leveraging another historical component, which is the idea that women are morally more pure, and that home and hearth creates a higher, more pure morality. Would you describe it that way, Laura? But these women actually ran on cleaning up politics. And when they entered the State House, they not only removed the spittoons and had folks stop smoking on the floor of the House, but they also kicked lobbyists off the floor of the House. So although cleaning house was an actuality, it was also a metaphor for cleaning up politics. And so that had an appeal during the silver crisis. And so by saying to the male voters, give us the chance to vote and we'll help you clean up and be change agents, really. And we see, as Laura mentioned, that over and over again after Watergate and after savings and loan crisis, and recently after recent perceptions of crises, we see an uptick in women getting elected because of that. And then the last piece is that slide that's up now, which is talking about our quite strict campaign finance rules in Colorado, and combined with low salary at the legislature, makes it a job that is not highly coveted by influential, wealthy men. And so women have the opportunity to get in and get themselves elected and serve. In California, where you are paid very well and you have a huge staff and it's a prestige position, we see less women. So that's just a factor. But that's kind of all wrapped into a bundle of why Colorado. And then, of course, the very last piece that led into that clip is that it builds upon each other. It builds upon itself. And a lot of my colleagues talk about who they are, who they want to see follow them. And of course, we have term limits. So you know you're only in for 8 years at the maximum. And so who are you going to help mentor in your community to make sure that there is folks who will be able to follow in your seat and keep your seat held by a woman, which is new. And then, not to belabor the point, but I'll just add the one modern sort of piece of it is that we're seeing younger women entering office with younger children, which was a huge barrier in previous generations. And we're really seeing for both men and women to be able to serve with younger children. That's sort of marking sort of societal trends on parenting, but it really was pretty prohibitive for women with young children to serve previously, and PS, hard for them to get elected. When I was first training people to run for office in the early 2000s, I guess, the rule of thumb was that women should never do campaign pictures with featuring their children, particularly if their children were young, because you would only hear from constituents that you shouldn't be leaving your children to go off to the Capitol, and that men should absolutely picture themselves with their children and their charming wives and puppy dogs. And that has completely, I think, changed as conventional wisdom and as a winning strategy. Now people are featuring their families of every shape and size.
So Colorado's been a leader in terms of the state legislature. That's indisputable, and we continue to be a leader. However, and there's this but after that, is there a glass ceiling? Because Colorado has never had a female governor, US senator, or mayor of Denver. And that would be our next clip. Quinn, if you can run that glass ceiling clip, that would be awesome.
Of course. Let's get that up.
What bothers me is we haven't had any U.S. senators that are female or governors.
It's an interesting paradox that we have, the highest number of women percentage-wise in the legislature, but we don't have, historically a woman governor or a woman senator or a woman mayor.
Well, I mean, it's been challenging for us even to get a congressperson.
Why 4 women? Why this small club?
For the most part, I think women sit around and wait to be asked. And that's not the way politics works.
Women need to be asked, and asked several times, and encouraged, and know that there is a support network there.
There's all kinds of groups now that train women to run early and to stay in.
We're getting that traction where we need to get more women elected.
When I ran for city council, it was a perfect time. My youngest child was graduating from high school.
And if women are getting into the playing field a lot later, then that has shortened their time in order to be actively involved.
I don't think women promote themselves and their own accomplishments.
It was really hard for me when I was first running for office to stand up and say, look at me, I'm great. That's just not something that comes naturally for most women.
I think it's less about who we're voting for. I mean, people in Colorado, I don't think they're saying like, oh, I don't know if I'd want to vote for a woman, as much as it is just the amount of money that people are able to acquire.
Doing a federal race is incredibly difficult. It's very demanding, and the amount of money somebody has to raise is huge.
You don't earn any money while you're on the campaign trail. So for many, many women, most women, they don't have the luxury to be able to take a year off and travel around the state and campaign.
And I think it's harder for women to ask for large contributions to their campaign?
I think money is a huge thing because I hear women get insecure and kind of, I too, I've needed people to help me. Would you call this person? Would you open a door for me? Would you make an entree? Could you do that? Would you do that for me? That's not easy to do. It's not easy to do.
Where we've had some disparity historically about access to capital, where there's sort of a cycle of the more engaged you are in executive or business or high level, high finance positions, the more likely you are to be networked with other people in that position. And so to the extent women are still catching up into those positions.
The guys are so much better sometimes at just recognizing and building those relationships of the give and take, and as women I don't think we're nearly as comfortable with that sometimes, and that's really where the money is coming from and the favors are coming from and the endorsements and all those things that get you to that next level.
I think sometimes it has to do with what your network is and building that network. For example, when I ran for office, I called everybody that I knew and asked them to max out to my campaign, but just naturally being a young candidate, I did not know as many people that could write a $400 check, and that limit is pretty low in comparison to other states.
At the state legislative level, we have those lower limits. The governor has higher limits. U.S. Senate has higher limits. So in order to hit your fundraising goals as a gubernatorial candidate or as a U.S. Senate candidate, you basically need to have a lot of people writing at least several $1,000 checks. Even the difference between few hundreds and few thousands is a lot, because suddenly the number of people I know who can write a $1,000 check is much, much lower than the number of people I know who can write $50 to $100 checks.
I ran.
Okay, I think that's it. And so the question becomes, is there a glass ceiling? And then if there's a glass ceiling, why? And as you saw in that clip, there's a lot of talk about money, about the amount of money that's needed to run for Congress, to run for Senate. We've only had 5 female Congress members from the state of Colorado in the history of our state. So even running for Congress, even though we've broken that glass ceiling, sort of, it still takes a lot of money to run these races. And that's been a barrier for women, for people who don't have access to sort of the network of lawyers and corporate heads. It makes it much more difficult to raise that kind of money. And then the stage of life. We were talking about, Meg was talking about how women with younger children are getting more involved in politics. But over and over again, what we heard from women who have served in the state legislature, served in all kinds of elected offices in the past, they generally waited until their children were grown, out of high school. And so when women wait to run, what happens is they're not running for office, they're not starting their political careers until they are in their 40s, 50s, late 40s, 50s. And so what that does in the end is doesn't give them enough time to build the experience, to build their political career and their contacts, their networks, in order to run for the next levels up, in order to work towards and build towards running for the Senate. They're often much older by the time they've served their 8 years in the state house or at the state Senate and built that political career and that network. So the fact that women are starting to participate in politics, to run for elected office at a much younger age, even when, if they have children, when their children are young or even before they've had children, that means there's a lot more opportunity for those women as time goes by. We also talk on the film about the caucus process and how that can lead to, that in the past has led to women not having as much opportunity for these higher offices. The caucus process tends to concentrate towards the right or to the left these days. The people who bother to go to caucus and participate in that are party insiders generally. They have an agenda, a political agenda. And so in the past, that particularly held women back from getting through the caucus process. We heard that from both Democrats and Republicans. I think it's particularly true for Republican women in the last 10, 20 years. As the party has shifted more and more to the right, it's harder for women. Many of the Republican women that served in the past were much more moderate, and so they got pushed out in the caucus process in the party. And then we talk about party leadership holding women back from running for those higher offices. And by that, we don't just mean the state party chair or something like that. What we mean by that is the people behind the scenes who make big decisions, who really push candidates forward, who provide the money and the clout. And that tends to be an old boys network. Meg, would you say that that's still true, that there's still the old boys network?
We just saw this in our US Senate race. So there was a Democratic primary and process to pick who was going to go up against Cory Gardner, and the leadership in DC of the Senate flew out to Colorado and interviewed everyone and sort of picked their candidate, and sure enough, that's the one who emerged, which was John Hickenlooper, and they're basing that on their ideas of what constitutes electability, and of course they want to win. So someone who has proven themselves as a governor had a leg up on competition. The other interesting factor, I think, is so we have this success in the state legislature. We lead the nation. In the House, the Democratic caucus is actually majority female. We've had several female speakers in a row. We were on a roll, I think, with 3 in a row. And we've had Senate presidents who are female. But somehow that doesn't translate into running for Congress and winning, or running for US Senate, or running for governor. And so the question becomes, is the state legislature actually the launching pad for higher office? And we see among our 9-person congressional delegation, only 2 have served in the legislature. So Laura and I are often asked when we give presentations by young women, especially when we're at university crowds and things like that. Well, I'm interested in running. What do you suggest? And we always said, I think Laura will agree. We said the way we were trained, which was, hey, get yourself elected, get yourself on your city council, your school board, get yourself elected dog catcher, do whatever you need to do to get yourself elected, and then build from there. And now we say, well, that's one way to go about it. And another perhaps equally valid way is to establish yourself, have a successful life, be active in your community, be a successful, it seems to be a path to be a successful business person. That puts you in those boardrooms, that puts you in those circles, be a successful lawyer or whatever it is, and then leverage that and run for office. And so our Congress people quite often jump directly from entrepreneur to Congress. So it's, we haven't quite been able to leverage our success in the legislature in terms of numbers and percentage of women into higher office at the moment.
And so all of this begs the question. We have this great history, we have this glass ceiling issue, but why does it even matter? Why does it matter to have women in elected office? And Quinn, if you could play that last clip for us, and then we'll come back. Okay.
There are some issues, well, on all issues, I think it's important to have women participating on the floor. There are some issues where it is uniquely painful or really problematic to not have women on the floor.
It came down to the choice issue, and I think the environmental issues were central also.
I probably found more environmental support amongst the women
than the men.
But I do believe that women are more outspoken when they see something they truly believe is wrong.
We had enough women at that time that it was a critical mass, and we stopped some things. We maybe didn't pass anything, but we stopped some bad things as far as women were concerned.
And I have a distinct memory of one piece of legislation, and it was to mandate that insurance companies cover mammograms for women. It was a standing vote, and all those in favor stood, and every woman, both Republicans and Democrats, stood in support of the bill, and the men that stood tended to be men whose wives or sisters or mothers or a relative had had breast cancer. And so it was a very moving vote. Just think of the lives that were saved because of that. But that was my starkest example of women, no matter what party, what chamber, whatever, banding together to get something really meaningful passed.
I think it might have been emergency contraception, and because men yell louder on a voice vote, a standing vote was called for, and they walked over to our side of the aisle, and all of the women stood in unison, and it was a pretty powerful moment.
But I can remember Norma coming and standing with all of us. Somebody was running a bill, and we all stood there, all the Democratic women, and she was the only Republican. She came over and she stood with us, and we all kind of glared at the man that was running that bill. And I almost like to show solidarity that this is a woman's issue, this matters to us, and this is what we think of it.
I call it sometimes the vagina caucus. And not only did women bring about women's issues, but women were also active in all issues.
It is supposed to work that way. It doesn't happen that way enough. But you do see a lot of, and there are a lot of really good, strong legislators and good, strong women that have run difficult bills with all the odds against them, and they've gotten it through. And that's really to be admired.
And so I collaborated then with Claire Traylor, Senator Claire Traylor, a Republican in the Senate, to carry a welfare reform bill, but a positive one, not one that seemed to look down on anybody who would get welfare. We actually got the bill passed in both chambers, and it was good. It did a lot of things that were really positive to help people get off welfare, not to punish them for being on welfare. And that was a woman's approach, very definitely.
I'm convinced that if we had more women in charge in Washington, we certainly would not be at the stalemate that we are today and have been now for a few years, because women don't waste their time.
I think women in the legislature are often much more fearless about taking on issues that mean a lot to them, and women have been in the forefront on same-sex marriage. They will often vote against what their own party is saying just because they're going for what they believe in. And I think that's something you get more with women politicians, where they're going to vote from the heart and the heart of their constituents.
But there are many of you here who I know love and respect me for who.
All right. So the question of why does it matter to have women in elected office, as you saw in that clip, first of all, demographically, you want your legislature to look like your state. You want it to reflect the diversity of your state. So having women in the legislature seems obvious, but it's a constant struggle. And then there's the question of leadership style. We heard over and over again from women that we interviewed that they were more collaborative than the men were. That they would collaborate to find solutions to problems and write legislation. It got to the point when we were doing our interviews and making the film that Meg and I wanted to create a drinking game around the word collaborate, because it was so much a theme of what we heard from women who have served. And then the type of legislation that women carry. And the type of legislation they support. When Meg mentioned women having served more recently as Speaker of the House, Majority Leader, president of the Senate, those are the people that set the agenda and decide which legislation is going to get assigned to which committees and whether it's going to even have a chance. Having women not only carry those bills, but make those decisions about the agenda is really important to get various types of legislation passed that reflects that demographic diversity of the state. And so in the early days, you had women who worked on legislation around labor issues, around children's issues, which were also labor issues at that time, juvenile justice, and women worked for a good 40, 50 years before women were allowed onto juries in this state. And women carried those bills year after year, session after session. Post 1970, when you saw more women in the legislature, women fought for things like insurance coverage for mammograms and emergency contraception and various welfare issues. And that brought a different perspective than the perspective of the men who had dominated the legislature prior to that. And more recently, we see women advocating for and carrying legislation around childcare, sick leave. Meg, do you have any other examples you can think of the kind, why it makes a difference to have women in the legislature right now?
We have one coming through on, well, we see it a lot on the intersection of reproductive technology. So infertility treatments and things like that, you know, members have actually experienced. And we see this across broad issues when we were doing our police accountability bill, when members would go, African-American members would go to the microphone and discuss their interactions with police, despite being, you know, 60 years old and an elected official, how they were viewed differently than their white counterparts. Those are very emotional moments in the chamber, and they really does change hearts and minds. So when you happen to be a woman who's experienced whether it's rearing children or having children or trying to conceive or going through breast cancer or any of these things that are really personal, there's a lot of elder care issues. Women tend to be the caretakers of their parents quite often. And so, and then I think we've really risen in unison to talk about disability issues, because so many women are active in caring for individuals with disabilities, whether they be elderly or intellectual disabilities. And so, and then the big kahuna is education, where women are just really beating down the door and trying to do what's right in a tough environment for public education. But Laura, I want to make sure we leave enough time for questions, so I don't want to talk too much.
Yeah, thanks. And so real quick before we go to questions, since the film was made, a lot of various issues have come up that could create a whole new film. Things that we weren't talking about at that time, just 5 years ago, 6 years ago when we were doing most of these interviews. But some examples of the kinds of things that have come up and changed is the 2018 elections. That was a huge moment for more and more women being elected across the state, across the country. The Me Too movement, we weren't even asking questions about sexual harassment. When we were doing the interview, we only had one legislator bring it up when we were interviewing them about various issues. But that could, of course, be its own film. And Colorado was dealing with that heavy issue in a big way a couple of years ago. We have intersectionality with race and gender issues, more and more of that kind of thing. As Meg mentioned earlier, more women with young children serving in office now. We now have a female vice president. I see Quinn snuck in to turn on the lights in here because the sun has gone down up in the mountains. So we have our first female vice president. The end of the film itself is the line of course, I look forward to the day we have a female president. And so now we have a female vice president. And note that we have had female candidates for governor, Senate, Denver mayor on both sides of the aisle since 2016, and none of them were successful in getting elected. So unfortunately, that part of the film, that theme of the film has not changed. We still don't have a female governor, senator, or mayor of Denver. Let's see. But, so if you'd like to share the Strong Sisters story, you can let people know they can see it for free on YouTube. Again, you can get DVDs here at the Summit Historical Society at the Old Schoolhouse. You can follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. And we have a free teacher's guide for all of those who are trying to make their way through these weird times of teaching. If you need another resource, it's all right there at our website for free. And so Quinn, I'd love to see if anybody has any questions. Open it up for discussion.
You
or
can put
questions.
it, you can raise your hand, or we can put it in the chat, or.
Yeah, does anyone have any questions? Let's make sure. Yeah, so I am able to be heard. If anyone has any questions about what they heard or any questions about how to get involved.
I should say the teacher's guide is married to curriculum. We received a grant from a civics organization, and they helped us make a teacher's guide. So, and it isn't watch the whole hour. It's little clips and then activities that are matched to curriculum. So if you have folks that are teachers, we're happy to send them the DVD so that they can use it in their classroom, or they can also do it the same way that everyone else can and use it. Sometimes in classrooms, it's easier to use the DVD as you can queue up to the chapter point. And the guide is kind of meant to be worked with the DVD. So just let us know. We're happy to give, we have people who've sponsored DVDs for teachers. So happy to have that happen. Although because of Lynn Bartle's quote about the JJ caucus, we recommend that it's maybe 8th grade and above, not super elementary school, although of course you could show clips that didn't include that quote.
We do have warnings about certain parts of the film that may need to be more a high school or college audience.
And one thing that definitely about post 2016, one question we started getting more and more recently is, why did you make a whole film based on the gender binary of men and women? And it's a valid question, and we talked a lot about it amongst ourselves, Laura and I, and consulted experts, and we really felt like that's the lens that these women saw themselves through. I mean, the majority of the film is historical, and certainly women entering politics viewed themselves as operating in a gender binary. We're more fluid now, and as we go forward, that's a whole nother chapter we could do. There's so many more chapters we could do. But I don't see any questions. We must have been so thorough, Laura.
I know personally it was a lot of information that was really, really good. And I was definitely one that has watched the documentary, and I really enjoyed watching the documentary. And I'm glad that that you brought in the Frisco women that really helped out historically up here.
The Petticoat, were they the Petticoat Council?
Yes, right?
Petticoat Government, Petticoat Council, and Grover, Colorado, which is out on the Eastern Plains, also wound up with an all-female council in, I think, the early 30s, maybe late 20s, early 30s, for some of the same kind of reasons. There was so much corruption in the government, and that was during Prohibition. And so there was a whole bunch of problems in this small prairie town. And of course, every one of those stories is a gem for me and for Meg. Frisco, I've got to say, the Frisco Historical Museum was so helpful to us with photos and such. They were so generous. as was the library up in Leadville. You know, any smaller institution is often much more generous than the statewide ones, which all charge a fee. So we're eternally grateful to the small libraries and museums across this state.
Well, thank you all.
Yeah.
I'm glad we finished up.
Please, if you have any questions or thoughts after this presentation, feel free to shoot us an email, reach out to us on Facebook or Instagram, that kind of thing. And we'd be happy to answer your questions or provide more information.
Well, if no one, one new message. Okay. So if no one has any questions, it was a fantastic presentation, and pretty much people are just saying how wonderful and great it was. That you know,
Support
thank you
Summit,
so much.
I'm sure they're already all Summit Historical Society supporters, but
Yeah.
Laura and I really benefited from small historical societies and picture archives, and we did 4 years worth of research on this, and it was, so we appreciate historical societies and the role that they play in Colorado, and so we're delighted to spend this evening with you and encourage continued support of such places. And thank you so much for having us, for having me.
Yeah, thank you. We were so happy to have you today, and we really learned a lot about this particular part in history, and I hope it kind of encouraged people to kind of get involved and find out what they can do as well. And thank you, Meg, and thank you, Laura. You definitely.
Well, I should also give a shout out to your state representative is a fabulous female, Julie McCluskey. She serves as the ranking House member on the Joint Budget Committee, which is a very powerful position. And we're doing budget supplementals this week, so she will be highlighted. But she's just a terrific example of all that is, you know, we run the gamut. We've had terrible women legislators, and we've had fantastic ones. Your gender doesn't guarantee quality, and you really have a good representation up at Summit. And so thank you for sending her our way.
Yes, thank you. And I hope everyone has a wonderful, wonderful weekend. And of course, we have some links here for you, how to get involved with our society and how to join, as well as new events. And then, of course, the link to Strong Sisters. Thank you so much and have a wonderful, wonderful day. Bye.